Look at that.
All right. Hey,
All right.
we're live. Hey, calling Chris Anderson in Windsor.
This is Chris Anderson. I am still in Windsor. And Rick, you are still in Chicago.
I am in Chicago. I'm here for all the rest of the shows this year. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show and for sending us out on the road. You're headed out on the road in another week or so.
No, tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow.
Leaving for Bastogne for the 80th anniversary of the Ardennes.
Wow. Tomorrow morning. Whether you're watching live, watching a replay, or listening on the HHH podcast. We're glad you're here. Today we'll be talking about Churchill and FDR in the White House. So let us know that you're here and what you're drinking. And Chris, I want to ask you about Belgium, but I want to just mention a thank you to everybody who supports us on Patreon, and especially our top shelf patrons. And you can join this group by clicking on patreon.com/history happy hour. I know it looks a little tight there, but we can
always make room. Yeah.
We can fit more people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Hey, Chris, do you have as you head off to Belgium and the Battle of the Bulge, do you have a favorite spot that's particularly moving or particularly you just particularly like to visit?
Oh, I have lots of spots I like to visit, but actually the first spot we go to at Hollerath, it's where we get a bunch of dragon's teeth there. And it's the spot where the Germans first hit the 99th Division. Very evocative, lots of foxholes. And then just down the path that we are going to be at is the spot where Captain MacDonald was, so the man who was company commander. He has a very evocative description of that. So that's always a pretty neat place to start.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I like Lanzerath. That's a
good one
spot. Big up on the hillside. I was just there for the first time recently, and I thought you'd be able to see more from up there, but I think you could see more.
Well, if I take you back, I'll show you how to get into the woods and you go into the foxholes.
Okay. Wow. We'll have to go together. Maybe
sometime soon. Yes, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Chris. We should probably. Is there anybody watching?
Yes.
Tell me who's there.
Gwendolyn Grimes Simmons, Greg Phelps, Lorelei Cohn, Carolyn Goff, Ron Dries.
Martin Bull. Xavier's here again.
Xavier's back, so we're international again.
He's commenting on your tie.
Thank you, Xavier.
David, and we're watching Xavier. We're watching whether you're here or not. Lizzie Borden here. All right, Chris, we should get to our guests. So why don't you give me a cue and we'll get this thing started.
That was a pretty lame.
Okay.
All right, better. I feel better.
The bar is open.
The bar.
What do we got going on?
Yeah, well, you had mentioned we're here to talk this week about somebody I greatly admire, Winston Churchill, and we are going to be talking with Robert Schmuhl, who is the Walter Annenberg Edmund P. Joyce Professor Emeritus of American Studies and Journalism at the University of Notre Dame. I read that from the sheet, so and he has taught there since 1980. He is the author and editor of numerous books, including Ireland's Exiled Children, America in the Easter Rising, Wounded Titans, American Presidents and the Perils of Power, in addition to Indecent Liberties, 50 Years with Father Hesburgh, The Glory and the Burden, and so many more words and Demanding Democracy, all published by the University of Notre Dame Press. But as I mentioned, we're here to talk about Winston Churchill, and we're going to talk about Bob's new book, Mr. Churchill in the White House, The Untold Story of a Prime Minister and Two Presidents. So that's what's on tap.
Bob Schmuhl, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Welcome, Bob.
Thank you very much. I think Winston Churchill should be the patron saint of the History Happy Hour, but we can get into that.
I think that's an outstanding idea. I like this.
I think he totally is. As a child, both of Britain and America, and there's right. Chris is there in Windsor, UK. I'm here in Chicago. We are like Winston Churchill. If you put us together,
right? Well, I'm almost big enough.
Yeah. Bob, did you bring a cocktail to this event tonight?
Only water, because I wanted my half-wits about me.
Fair enough.
But we'll move into that later.
Okay.
And
All right.
Chris, did you bring? You have something different.
I did different. It's a Windsor and Eaton brewery. It's Three Grenadiers. It's the local ale from the local brewery. So we went and got our Christmas growler today. And you?
I have an Oban, actually a Port Charlotte Scotch
nice.
from. So here's to that.
Yes, excellent. So we should get started then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Bob, I was looking over some notes. I had some notes from an earlier show about Eleanor Roosevelt, and she had written an article for The Atlantic talking about December of 1941. In it, she said, "My husband told me we would be having some guests visit us. He told me I could not know who was coming, nor how many, but I must be prepared to have them stay over Christmas. He added as an afterthought that I must see to it that I had good champagne and brandy in the home and plenty of whiskey." Obviously, we have an inkling of who this guest might be. So who was Eleanor talking about? And what brought about the first of, I guess, what was it, 5 visits to the White House wartime? How did these visits come about?
The visits came about because Winston Churchill desperately wanted the United States involved in the war, and many of his speeches before Pearl Harbor called on the United States to get more involved and to help him and Britain as they fought off the Nazi threat. So that shortly after the bombing, the attack of Pearl Harbor, he makes the decision, I am going to America. And he leaves on December the 13th, and it's a ferociously difficult voyage. And in fact, they thought it would take something like 6 or 7 days. It took 10. And I think the principal reason that Churchill wanted to make the trip was that he now saw that Japan had attacked America, but he wanted America on his side with a Germany first policy. And the only way that he could accomplish that was by directly dealing with Franklin Roosevelt and the military leaders of the American government. So he comes over and he says, and this possibly could be irritating to someone like Eleanor Roosevelt, he says he'll stay a week and he leaves 24 days later. So that I think the food supply and the alcohol supply was dwindling by January the 12th when he actually did depart. But it was a key trip, and it receives most of the attention by historians. And in my book, what I tried to do is to tell the whole narrative of what his subsequent visits, and there were 7 to the White House, to the presidents, involving him. What did he do during those times? And it's quite interesting. When Franklin Roosevelt was president, he went to the White House. Churchill went to the White House 4 times, and he went to Hyde Park 4 times. When Eisenhower was president, he comes over in 1954, and Churchill is back as prime minister 51 to 55. And then in 1959, it's something of a sentimental journey of the former prime minister coming to meet the president of the United States. So it's something of a full circle moment. And Eisenhower takes him to his farm outside Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, so that the special relationship that he talked about and fostered became something important in his own life.
Yeah.
So, give us a sense of how unique this is, right? Because this is not a head of state coming to Washington and then coming for a meeting with the president. This is a head of state moving into the White House and kind of making it his own and doing it multiple times over a few year period. Is there anything else like this in our history?
No. And one of the members of the White House staff once said that he acted as if he belonged here. And there was one instance in September of 1943 when Franklin Roosevelt left the White House and returned to his home at Hyde Park, New York, and just said, Winston, use the White House as your own. If you want to have meetings here, that's fine. Could we imagine today a president leaving the White House and having the head of a government of another country stay behind and live there
and meet
there
with the Joint Chiefs and
Sure,
have a press
sure.
conference and do all that stuff while the president is off at Camp David or something?
Right, exactly. I mean, think that through. And so one of the stories about the Churchill visits, and this quite explicitly from the first one, Eleanor Roosevelt was outside in the hallway on the second floor of the White House, which is the living quarters. And about 3 a.m. finds Winston Churchill shuffling around, and she says, so where are you going? And he says, I want to pursue a point with the president about one of the things we were talking about. And she says, I think it can probably wait until breakfast. And not too long after that, she went to her husband and said, why doesn't the U.S. government buy Blair House? It can serve as the president's guest house for foreign dignitaries. And in 1942, the United States government purchased the Blair House. But the irony of that story, that incident in history, is that Winston Churchill never stayed at Blair House. He just kept coming back to the White House, whether it was Franklin Roosevelt or Dwight Eisenhower who was president.
Maybe he couldn't find the Blair House. I mean, it's across the street. It's hard to.
Yeah, right. And it's more obscure.
The cellar's not as big. So Churchill says, because obviously we now sort of take it for granted that Britain and the United States has this special relationship, and you go into some detail in the book about how in a lot of ways it's very much a byproduct of Churchill's really working at this and creating this situation. You quote a letter from Churchill to, as I recall, it's his wife, Clementine, where he says, "We live here as a big family in the greatest intimacy and informality." Is that the case? Was it that intimate? And if so, kind of how did that manifest itself? What did it look like?
Chris, it was not a letter to Clementine. It was a dispatch back to the government, back to the cabinet. And he's trying to impress the war cabinet back in London that he's making progress, that we're working together on the war effort and all of that. It was an extraordinarily informal and intimate situation, much to the chagrin of Eleanor Roosevelt. But they would, and this is in Churchill's memoirs, that they would go into each other's bedrooms and, discuss things. His line, I believe, is that both of us worked in bed a lot. And that was true. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt, with his incapacity, would often be in bed in the morning, and Churchill rarely got out of bed in the morning. In his wonderful phrase, he was a tardy riser. And when they would be awake, they would move between rooms, bedrooms. Lord Halifax, who was the ambassador from the United Kingdom to the U.S., was appalled when he was visiting Churchill's quarters, the Rose bedroom. It was always the Rose bedroom. It's now called the Queen's bedroom, but at that point it was called the Rose bedroom. But he would go in and he would see all of these glasses of booze, forgive me. He would see all these cigars. He would see the secretaries swirling around, taking dictation, bringing in papers, and all of this. And it was chaos that he could not abide. And he kept saying that in his diary. How does anything happen in this place that is so different from usual office practice? So that when he talks about the intimacy, the informality, it is there. And Churchill is romping around in his siren suit, tailored out of velvet, and he's wearing his slippers and, visiting the map room with FDR at all hours of the day and night. He literally made himself at home. And what's interesting about that first visit, he arrives on December the 22nd in the evening. And on the 23rd, the president and the prime minister have a press conference. In a way, it was the announcement. This is the arrival of Winston Churchill in the White House. The next day is the lighting of the national Christmas tree, and both FDR and Churchill speak at that. And he says words to the effect, "I do not feel a stranger here at the center and at the summit of the United States." He knew he was on a big stage. Christmas comes on the 25th. What does he do on the 26th? He addresses Congress. So these very public occasions herald his arrival. And then they get down to business of the war strategy and how they would function as allies during the war itself.
So we'll get on to some of the later visits, but there's a famous story from that first visit that needs addressing here, because FDR comes into Churchill's room one morning and finds Churchill sans clothing, in the nude. And Churchill essentially, he's come to tell him that he's thought of a better name for the Allied countries. It's going to be the United Nations. He's coming in to tell him he's thought of this phrase, the United Nations. And Churchill has nothing on and responds essentially saying, well, as you can see, Mr. President, I have nothing to conceal from you. Terrible Churchill imitation, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I should have asked you to do it, Chris.
Don't quit your day job.
Okay. So
Yeah.
Is this story true? If it's true, how do we know it's true? And did you find out anything that you didn't know about it or that you found interesting when you dug into it?
You're not the first person who's asked that question. That seems to be the burning
Yeah, Bob, aren't you
query.
happy that all that research and everything, it always comes down to, was Churchill naked in the bathtub?
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
one reviewer was bold enough to say that I discussed it in greater detail than he thought was necessary.
I could always have used more. So
Right, exactly. And the pictures will be in the second edition, but it is true. But here's I'm going to give you two different angles on this. One is that if Churchill is absolutely correct in saying that the incident occurred on January the 1st of 1942, my research shows that it probably happened about between 9:30 and 10:15 on that New Year's Day. Now, how do I date that? He is returning from Canada. He had given a speech to the Canadian Parliament, and the train is bringing him back because FDR has invited him to the National Prayer Service on New Year's Day of 1942. And so, and you can check all of the reporting and all of the records about this. He gets back to Washington about 9 o'clock to the train station, goes immediately back to the White House, must have jumped into the tub right after he got there. So he'd be prepared to go to the prayer service. And the president comes in unannounced and says, "I've got it, United Nations." And previously they had been called the Associated Powers. That's not a phrase that tumbles off of your tongue easily. But United Nations, that was Roosevelt's phrase. And allegedly, Churchill said, the Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to conceal to the President of the United States. Fast forward to early January, and this people have not reported on, but Wendell Willkie, who was the Republican candidate for president in 1940 and defeated by Franklin Roosevelt for his third victory as president. Wendell Willkie, who is now an ally of Roosevelt on the war effort, is visiting the White House. And the president says, "Would you like to stop and see Winston while he's here?" And Wendell Willkie, who has met Churchill before, said, "Oh, sure." So they go again to the Rose bedroom, and the president says to the person outside the door, "Is your man up yet?" And the guard says, "I don't think so." And he said, "Well, let's see." So they just throw open the door, and there he is again. And what does Winston Churchill say at that moment? "Pray excuse my state of nature. Please come in." So that these stories are swirling all around. And that story is in a self-published book by the person who heard it, which is kind of interesting, which I discovered over in Cambridge. But the upshot, and I will end this story with this: Franklin Roosevelt loved to tell the tale. And he went to Grace Tully, his his Irish Catholic secretary and said, "You know, Grace, I'm just thinking about it. Winston is pink and white all over." And he told other people that Winston was pink and white all over. And if you track it, as I have, you find it in the diary of even the Canadian Prime Minister, who was talking to Roosevelt one time about Churchill. And Roosevelt says, "You know, did I ever tell you the story about walking in on him?" So did it happen? Yes. Are we sure of the words that were spoken? I think we're sure of the "pray excuse my state of nature." Whether we're sure of the other statement, I'm not convinced of that.
So, Bob, I mean, other than this being the most important topic that you discuss in the book,
the war is just a minor.
That's just a minor.
The war's
point.
barely going on. Yeah.
It's
Well, maybe
detail.
we'll let Rick come up with some more accents to ask different
Yeah.
questions. But until we have that chance, what, pirates? Are there pirates in your book, Bob?
That's a sequel too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyway,
I was reading ahead.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, it is easy when you read any book about Churchill, not just yours, to get lost in the stories and the anecdotes and all that, and you can fall into that trap. But you talk about in the book some important things that are happening. These visits are important. So maybe you could kind of touch on some of the things that these two men discussed, some of the decisions that were arrived at during these visits, and, you know, if possible, work in why, you know, being there in the White House was important for these decisions to be made.
Yeah, I think most importantly, it was Churchill's way of really securing and solidifying the alliance. He wanted to do it himself. I think he was a figure who had enormous self-confidence and felt that he had to be on the scene to achieve the objectives that he wanted. And I say that not only in the instance of coming to the White House during the war and also later during the Cold War, but he on his own went to Moscow to meet with Stalin. Churchill made about 24 or more trips abroad during the war, because he felt that he had to be on the scene to give other leaders advice, try to sway them to his thinking, and all of that. In the first visit, they make the decision that there will be a central command in Washington, and that was one of the decisions that they made. They also talked about trying to unify the transportation that was occurring. These, in many ways, were nuts and bolts decisions. And later, of course, we get into the big decision about Operation Overlord and D-Day, and when that's going to take place, and who's going to be in charge of that. So that Churchill is very well aware that Great Britain is on its back foot, that the empire is wavering. It's not as strong as it was when he was a younger person. And he sees the United States as the emerging power. I don't want to use empire, that's too loaded, but the emerging power, militarily, economically, in many different respects, politically. And he wants to hitch the UK's wagon to that. And I think it's one of the reasons why he begins to talk. His first phrase is fraternal association, which then evolves into special relationship. And people tend to forget, but in 1943, he went to Harvard to receive an honorary degree. And at that point, he even suggested common citizenship. Let me repeat that: common citizenship between the peoples of the United Kingdom and the United States. Now, I don't think in this era of Brexit that we talk in that kind of language anymore, but it really underlines what he is trying to accomplish. And he wants Britain, he wants the United Kingdom to still be perceived as a major power. But he also sees that America is going to be the dominant power. The Great Britain will be in that shadow, but Great Britain will still be there and be a player. So that when you get into the Eisenhower years, he is saying, when he comes over in 1954, let's have a summit with the Soviet Union. Let's bring the big three back together as we did at Tehran and Yalta and Potsdam. And Eisenhower will have none of that. But again, it's a way of interjecting the power that he felt that Great Britain should show the world. And he would do that himself. He wanted to always parlay at the summit, and he wanted to be one of the principal actors.
I want to remind everybody that we are chatting today with Bob Schmuhl, who is the author of Mr. Churchill in the White House, The Untold Story of a Prime Minister and Two Presidents. For me, the $64,000 question, which does not involve nudity, that really was a lesser. That was like a $12,000.
You gotta let that one go. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
You know,
now you're going to cover yourself, and,
yeah.
so to speak.
I'm already covered here. Okay. I like the comment that Susan Yu said, I cannot unsee this. She wrote in the comments. So the question is, were they really friends? Okay. So before Churchill even comes to the White House, they are corresponding. They are talking on the telephone where Churchill's there in the cabinet war rooms talking over the Sig Sally system to Washington, D.C. He's coming and he's spending all this time, and he portrays it, and it is portrayed by both countries as, it's a personal friendship that has become the foundation of the alliance. But to quote from you in your book, the depth and affinity of their human relationship would remain ambiguous. And if their friendship is not as real as they want people to believe, I mean, you've kind of answered this, but what exactly are they getting out of this? So address this however you will, but what about their friendship?
I'm not sure that friendship is in the realm of possibility in terms of what we're talking about, what Churchill is trying to achieve, and what Roosevelt is also doing. And I say that quite advisedly, in that in the book, I point out that there are people who think that Franklin Roosevelt never had any friends, that he was a totally political person. Eleanor herself said that he wasn't close to the children. Now, having said that, they want to convey to the public their closeness, and that the alliance really hangs on them and the way that they are able to handle things. Having said that, both of them are raconteurs. Both of them have enormous self-confidence. Both of them enjoy similar things. Both of them have sort of a naval experience. Both of them are readers of books. Both of them come from aristocratic backgrounds. So that I think that they had certain things in common. Then they did get along. Don't misinterpret what I am trying to say. But both of them understood their roles too. And by understanding their roles, I would argue that early on, Franklin Roosevelt saw Winston Churchill as something of a mentor. Winston Churchill knew a lot more about war and military affairs than Franklin Roosevelt. Let's face it, Roosevelt was the person who had brought the United States back as much as possible during the Depression. Now he is having to turn and become, as he says, Dr. Win the War rather than the Depression. And so Churchill's experience of being prime minister from May the 10th, 1940, until he arrives at the White House on December 22nd, 1941, that period, 18 months or so, has been very influential in shaping him. He's also, and people tend to forget this, he's not only prime minister, he's defense minister. He's calling all the shots for the military. So he comes to Washington with 5 long documents of what he wants to see done and how he wants to see the next phase of the war unfold. And this is all new to Franklin Roosevelt, and he's going to rely on that. He's certainly listening to it as he makes his own decision. But I date from about the end of 1943 onward. And remember, Franklin Roosevelt dies in April of 1945. Yalta has been, the Yalta Conference took place in February of 1945. So during that whole period, late 43 into the first portion of 45, I see Roosevelt being much more assertive. And he, at that point, is beginning to see Stalin as a more important ally than Winston Churchill. And by him sort of catering and cozying up to Stalin, Churchill is offended. In fact, at the Tehran conference, Roosevelt has the feeling that he's not breaking through with Joseph Stalin. And he sees Stalin's power and his number of people who are in the military and all of that. And Roosevelt on the spot decides he's going to make fun of Churchill in front of Stalin to ingratiate himself to Stalin, to make him a warmer sort of figure. And Churchill comes into the conference room, and Roosevelt sort of turns to him and say, "You might not like what I'm going to say." And, he puffs on his cigar and finds his seat and sits down. But then Roosevelt starts roasting him in front of Stalin, and Stalin starts laughing. And now, according to Roosevelt, the ice has been broken and he can deal with him. Later, Churchill says, it's an interesting metaphor. He said that he felt like a donkey between the Russian bear and the American buffalo. But the donkey knew the way home, saying, he knew a way that the other two didn't. From that point on, you see Roosevelt less friendly to Churchill. In fact, in 1944, the first Quebec conference is the summer into September of 1943. The second one is in September of 1944. And what's interesting is Churchill, for the first several months of 1944, tries to create and to establish a way of meeting with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt doesn't want to. He finds reasons that he can't. He's ill, he's not available, he can't do it. Finally, in September of 1944, Churchill makes the trip again to Quebec. This time, he's not invited to the White House. He is invited to Hyde Park for 2 days. Secretive, clandestine meeting. It was not announced until Churchill had returned to London. And I see that as interesting in and of itself, but also the way that Roosevelt was keeping him at sort of arm's length. I think there was a political reason. Remember, Roosevelt has decided he's going to run for a 4th term. And he's going to announce his campaign in September of 1944. He does not want to be perceived as using Churchill as someone who is helping his campaign. So that's why they keep the visit to Hyde Park secret for as long as they did. But you also just don't see the closeness that had existed in the years before. Part of it probably is Roosevelt's declining health. I think that's a factor in all this. But it's also a factor that America was now the dominant ally in terms of the number of people involved in the war, in terms of the armaments that were being supplied. And Churchill had promised General Allenbrook, that he would be in command of Operation Overlord. And once America was the dominant power, America got the decision, and Dwight Eisenhower became the supreme Allied commander, expeditionary force, and all that. And that really drove a stake into the heart of Allenbrook. I mean, it had been promised to him, but the reality of the situation was America was much stronger, and they would not accept second fiddle in this totally important operation to go into Western Europe.
So Bob, we had this question earlier in the show, and I just wanted to get to it now. Obviously, we talked quite a bit about all of these visits that Churchill is making to the White House, and we'll never come to a conclusion on the debate about how close the relationship was, or what they meant. But you don't see that with Truman. So why aren't there visits at that point? Why isn't he continuing that sort of association?
The couple reasons for that. One is that Churchill is out of power.
Right.
Remember, he is ousted as prime minister in July of 1945. VE Day is May of 45. They decide to have a general election, the first since 1935 in Britain. And at the you can't make this stuff up. They are at Potsdam, and this is the first meeting that Harry Truman has with Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, of course, is there. And during the meeting in Potsdam, the results of the election are announced, and Winston Churchill has been removed as prime minister. And so he packs his bags, and Clement Attlee, the new prime minister, comes to Potsdam and finishes the conference. So that when Truman is president, in most of his presidency, Churchill is out of power. He's the leader of the opposition in the House of Commons. Clement Attlee stays at the White House when Truman is there for a couple of nights, but Churchill himself does not. And what you have to remember is during the Truman years, the White House was under great renovation. And that's what sent Truman over to the Blair House. And he lived there and operated out of there for a number of years. But then when Eisenhower comes back and Churchill is reelected for a second term, and if you combine his first term and his second term, it's longer than a two-term American president as prime minister. And when he's in office, he recovers from a serious stroke and comes to America and meets with Eisenhower, and it's all well and good, and you can see the picture of Churchill with his back and Eisenhower there. And as I mentioned before, he comes back in 59 for another visit. And imagine this, the President of the United States cleared his calendar for 3 days and just to take Winston Churchill around, to meet people, to do things with him, to take him to the Gettysburg farm. I try to argue in the book that I think there was a closer relationship between Churchill and Eisenhower than there really was between Churchill and Roosevelt.
Well, these are both Chris's heroes, so I mean, this is this is the moment that we can just honor that. I want to go back. We've moved beyond the Roosevelt presidency, but I'm not quite ready to do that yet. So I'm going to take us back. One of the things I found interesting in the book is how the interactions between Churchill and FDR offer a window into FDR's personality. And we've touched on this a little bit, but you use a quote from Isaiah Berlin, who's a British philosopher who's working for the British government in Washington at this time. And here's what he says about Roosevelt. The president really is very queer, not at all what you think he is. I have reached the conclusion that despite the gay and generous nature and all the manners and sweep of an old established landowning squire, he is A, absolutely cold, B, completely ruthless, C, has no friends, D, is becoming a megalomaniac and is pulling our Mr. Churchill along rather than vice versa. So I wondered to what extent you think that captured reality.
I think it captured a lot of reality. I think Berlin had spent a lot of time over here in the embassy, and Berlin was a great, what would you say, associate of the people who were in journalism, in government, in education. By that I mean university life. And he was something of a vacuum cleaner. He would sweep up interesting nuggets of information, and then he would write reports back to London, and they were read quite closely by people because they knew how shrewd Berlin was. And I think it's for a Roosevelt fan, a brutal quote to read. I found it in doing research at Oxford, the actual typescript of it. And it was a letter to his parents, just explaining what he was doing and what he was thinking about. I think that whole business of not having friends is important. He had a secretary for a couple of decades, Missy Lehan, and she would tell stories about her knitting in the White House, and the president would just be sitting there, and they'd be visiting, and he didn't have people to talk to. This was just the secretary talking to him idly in an evening. So the whole Roosevelt myth, if you will, really is extraordinary. And I think that Berlin sort of captures it, but he captures it from listening to people and studying him as closely as he could during his years when he was serving the British government by working in the embassy in Washington.
So Bob, I would say this for anybody who kind of writes a book about Churchill. It's well kind of trodden ground, and one of the things that's refreshing about your book is you're kind of looking at it from a new angle. But obviously, you went into this knowing a lot about Churchill. There's a lot that is kind of out there, I guess, that people understand about Churchill. Is there anything that, as you were doing your research, that surprised you about Churchill? Did you find out something new? Was there something in looking at this story through the angle of these visits that caused a light bulb to go off for you?
Yes, and I would put it this way: I was amazed and also impressed by the energy of one human being driven by a desire to make sure that his objectives would be met, and he would do anything to make that happen. Let me just briefly give you a sense of that energy. Earlier, I mentioned the 1943 Quebec conference. He sails from England, arrives in Canada, takes a train, and it takes about a day to get to Quebec City. He's there for a brief period of time, jumps on the train, and heads to Hyde Park. And he visits with Franklin Roosevelt for a couple days there. And then the Quebec conference is going to start in a couple days. He gets on the train, heads back. He's at the Quebec conference, lasts a week or so. Does he decide at the end of that he's going to go back to London? No. He jumps on the train and goes to Washington. And he's in Washington for another 2 weeks. And then he decides, okay, it is time to go. And he is away from London for six full weeks. But I figured out that he traveled roughly 5,000 miles on the train tracks of Canada and America, getting from point to point to really be at the center of action, either at the conference or at the White House. That was the same trip that when he received the honorary degree at Harvard. So he goes up to Boston from Washington, and he's back to Washington for more conferences. It was a boundless energy. And it really, I guess, impressed upon me the sense that here is somebody who knew that he had to be in the place where the action was happening. And he was willing to do that, and he'd travel and he'd be there. And the other thing is, during all those trips, he's writing all the time. So he had to come up with the speeches. He had to come up with the speech for the Harvard commencement. And he's telling his secretaries, let's get this done. Let's get this done. A fact that I often tell students. For a major address that Winston Churchill would deliver, it took him 1 hour of preparation for every minute of delivery. Now think about that. A 20-minute speech took 20 hours of work. So you combine the energy, the literary ability, the brains, and the strategic mind that he had, and I think you have a pretty interesting figure.
I would say so.
Bob Schmuhl, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about Winston Churchill and FDR and your book, Mr. Churchill in the White House, The Untold Story of a Prime Minister and Two Presidents. We so appreciate your being on History Happy Hour. It
was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care. So next week, Chris, we're in encore mode.
We are, yes.
We are. And you'll be in Belgium.
I will be. Yes.
I'll be in Key West, Florida.
I
better weather.
I see how this works.
Weather. You should really be leading the Key West tour. I don't know why you couldn't get in.
I keep telling the office, World War II in the Caribbean is a tour.
Yeah, I know. There's a great quote I read from Robert Cairo. He's working on Lyndon Johnson's biography. He says, "What? We're gonna have to move to the hill country in Texas for a few years for me to do research." And his wife says, "Why couldn't you do a biography of Napoleon?"
Right.
So we moved to Paris for a few years. Anyway. We'll go back almost 80 years to talk about a climactic battle fought in December 1944 in the Hurtgen Forest. And we'll be talking to Bob Drury, who's the co-author with Tom Clavin of The Last Hill, the epic story of a Ranger battalion and the battle that defined World War II. Okay, that's a big claim in the title, but it is an interesting story and worth revisiting just about 80 years after it happened.
Absolutely.
Hey, everybody, thanks for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on X, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.